A neighborhood like any other, an average American family, and an unspeakable evil here to take away everything they love. When Poltergeist was released in 1982, it was a massive hit, blending classic haunted house scares with a seemingly normal setting for a movie that became one of the defining horror films of the 80s. And with any hit comes sequels, 2 to be exact, and a remake 4 decades later. But beyond the thrills that came from the surprising combination of Tobe Hooper and Steven Spielberg behind the camera, Poltergeist's legacy has been defined by controversy over who truly controlled the movie, and a series of tragedies that have led many to label the film as cursed. But to me, Poltergeist is special because while it has all the trappings of a mainstream crossover blockbuster hit, its horror is defined by a deep, honest well of pain and loss that far outweighs its conventional jumps and scares. And more than 4 decades later and after countless imitators, the original Poltergeist still remains one of the greatest haunted house movies ever made because of its emotional center. From its classic original film to the movies that struggled to keep its story going, and through the real-life losses that shaped how we view these films, this is the family tragedy of Poltergeist. The making of Poltergeist starts with the one man whose attachment to the film would be the reason it was made, and the source of the biggest debates over its creation, Steven Spielberg. By the beginning of the 1980s, Spielberg had cemented himself as one of the biggest names in Hollywood thanks to the successes of Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and Raiders of the Lost Ark. And with many different projects on his plate, the director and producer soon set his sights on making a ghost story, briefly wanting Stephen King to write the script before choosing Michael Grace and Mark Victor when King was unavailable. Although Hooper would later say that he, Spielberg, and producer Kathleen Kennedy rewrote the script to be the film it truly became. But Spielberg was unable to direct the film for MGM Studios, which had partnered with his own Amblin Productions, due to directing E.T. the Extraterrestrial at the same time. In his place, Spielberg hired director Tobe Hooper, who, by this point, had already found success in theaters and on TV with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Salem's Lot. Of course, this being Spielberg, the film that became Poltergeist was aimed at a much more mainstream audience. So Hooper might seem like a strange choice given how Chainsaw is still one of the most controversial and disturbing horror films in history, but when you think of Salem's Lot, made for CBS and a big hit with mainstream audiences, it makes sense. In Poltergeist, we follow the Freeling family, made up of mom Diane, JoBeth Williams, dad Steve, Craig T. Nelson, oldest daughter Dana, Dominique Dunn, son Robbie, Oliver Robbins, and youngest daughter Carol Ann, Heather O'Rourke, who have recently settled in the newly made planned community of Cuesta Verde, California. But strange supernatural occurrences the family at first sees as fun turn dangerous, as Carol Ann is taken into the spirit realm, as the house is overcome by a legion of ghosts, and the monster known only as the Beast. Soon, the family and a small group of parapsychologists fight to get her back, as the malevolent presence from the other side grows in power. But what's special about Poltergeist is that its elements can be read in so many different ways. Is it a simple ghost story that places gothic scares into a modern setting? Is it a story about how grief, hope, and loss can transform a family? Is it a commentary on the new wave of suburban families and yuppie America? Is it about the fears of owning a home and all the worries that come from investing your money and life into something that may quickly fall apart around you? Yes, all of the above. With its combination of over-the-top supernatural elements and its setting of an average family in sunny California, Poltergeist is a classic haunting that smashes directly into suburban drama. It's also one of my favorite supernatural horror stories, because it's much more about a family's love, loss, and fears than it is about discovering the truth behind whatever ghosts and demons are living within the walls of a house. A lot of haunted house stories are about revealing a murder mystery or unresolved trauma in order to help the dead move forward. That's not the case in Poltergeist. We'll talk about how the sequels become much more about what's actually happening, but here, it's all about getting Carol Ann back. The supernatural elements of Poltergeist start with very subtle moments. It's maybe the defining image of the film, but the opening of Carol Ann speaking to a voice only she can hear coming from the TV static is so unsettling because it's simple. Obviously it doesn't happen now, but a static-filled TV in late-night hours after stations go off the air wasn't something out of the ordinary. Poltergeist often takes simple ideas, like a glass breaking or a storm getting close, and makes you paranoid about what might actually be causing it.
They're here.
Really, the modern American home takes our minds far away from the spiritual and supernatural. Whether you believe in any of that or not, it's a movie that, like John Carpenter's Halloween, makes us suddenly very aware of just how scary the suburbs can be in a different state of mind. Once upon a time, Steve was much more like the spiritually open Diane, but is now a more practical and worn-out authority figure in the home. Still, these two clearly love each other.
Now reach back into our past when you used to have an open mind. Remember that? Okay, just try to use that for the next couple of minutes.
As the supernatural elements start, Diane is excited when she should be worried, and Steve is skeptical when he should be trying to understand what's going on. After Carol Ann is taken, we see the toll it's taken on the family. All the phenomena have become well known to them, and life has completely changed as we see how Diane, who was already more open to the supernatural, is weathering it, while Steve has fallen apart. Also, I gotta give a special shout out to Zelda Rubinstein as Tangina. For only being in this movie for 15 minutes, she leaves a huge impression as the psychic who can finally make a difference. She's completely different from everyone else. Funny, blunt, but also reassuring as she helps save Carol Ann.
This house is clean.
It's all incredibly well shot by cinematographer Matthew Leonetti, who easily flips the mood back and forth between the mundane everyday and the creepily supernatural without manipulating the set. With Spielberg as producer, Industrial Light and Magic brought the effects to life under a $10.7 million budget, and composer Jerry Goldsmith creates one of my favorite horror scores ever, not just adding the unease and jumps needed for pure horror, but the unmistakable Carol Ann's theme. A lilting lullaby that's truly gorgeous, turning into a child's chorus for the film's end credits that's both comforting and sad. It's one of my favorite things about the movie. I think the scares here are so effective because they're seen and translated through very common fears. A thunderstorm, a big old tree, an open closet at bedtime. All of these fears are established really early on, but are shown to be just the byproduct of childhood worries, which both mom and dad can ease. Until the supernatural presence within the house makes those fears real, transposing childhood anxiety onto parents that can't dismiss it anymore. Poltergeist is also filled with critiques of and commentary on suburban America in the 80s. It's just that these are lying quietly underneath the more bombastic supernatural elements and the character relationships informing the drama of the film. Opening with the US national anthem puts us in that headspace. Yes, it's used to signal the sign-off of television for the night, which was a thing before 24-hour programming, but it also signals that this is an American story, and one that could only happen in this time of the United States. The Cuesta Verde community offers an idyllic home life, but even the next-door neighbors have no idea what's happening within these walls. Early on, we see Steve reading Reagan, the Man, the President, while he and Diane are smoking reefer, oh my god. And as we go on, we find out that the entire planned community of Cuesta Verde was built by moving an old cemetery aside. Or at least that's what Steve's boss says. The big reveal, and the focus of one of the all-time great movie freakouts, is that the dead were left underground and built over.
You son of a bitch, you left the bodies and you only moved the headstones! You only moved the headstones! Why? Why?
The huge climax also pushes the film's social critique to the forefront, as the dead and buried of America's past, whose land has been taken from them, are literally unearthed and come to reclaim what's theirs. What's funny is that Poltergeist is often cited as being caused by the homes being built over an indigenous burial ground, but it's very explicitly not. The movie even calls this out.
It's not ancient tribal burial ground, it's just people.
And while it's vague, the shapes of the spirits and the coffins of the rising dead are clearly not Native American, but instead residents and settlers from generations past. It's actually the Amityville Horror, The Shining, and Pet Sematary that use the tribal burial ground trope to establish their supernatural terrors. Although Poltergeist shares a lot of horror DNA with them. But most of all, Poltergeist is about confronting the realities of death as a family. It's not an accident that the film opens with Carol Ann's little bird Tweety dying, and the little girl finding out despite her mom's best efforts. Every kid eventually has to learn about death. Preferably, that's through something they read or watch, and at worst, from the loss of a pet. But even when a kid finds out about the permanency of death, it can take a long time for them to truly understand what it means. The same goes for Carol Ann. And while the circumstances that face the Freeling family are very exaggerated, wild supernatural events, they're all a metaphor for the loss of a child. This is a family that lost their daughter, and it's tearing them apart. Change Carol Ann being stuck in the supernatural dimension of the other side for her being sick in a hospital, and the metaphor becomes much more serious and devastating. Poltergeist's confrontation with the supernatural and the presence of the afterlife is both comforting and scary. The other side is there, but it's undefined and unknowable. We never see it, but we sense it. The sequels and remake would take us into the other side, but I like that it's never actually on screen here. And every person's interaction with it depends on who they were as a living person. Joyful or angry, willing to let go or desperate to hold on. There's the comfort that there's something there for us to pass on to when we're gone, but the horror that some things are there that see us, are jealous of us, hate us, changes how we think about everyday life. Poltergeist is not a subtle movie. It always surprises me with how big and obvious it goes with its supernatural element so early in the movie, unleashing its evil tree in a mini tornado in the first act, something most haunted house movies would save for the finale. The optical effects, like the tornado and the floating objects in Carol Ann's room, are a little janky. The compositing probably dealing with a little too much for the time period's technology. I know that the face-ripping scene is burned into the brains of anyone that saw it at too young of an age, but when you see it now, the effect is so obvious that it's hard to be scared. But Hooper's movie is filled with very quiet, intimate moments of conversation between its characters, and it's those scenes that make this movie so special to me. Scenes like Diane and Dr. Lesch's whispered late-night conversation about the nature of death and the afterlife are beautiful. They feel so real, so honest. I love the connection that grows between these two, which informs a lot of the most emotional moments of the movie.
Grandpa's dead. I looked at him in the hospital bed, and I was watching, but I didn't see anything go up out of him.
Again, this is about the acceptance of death's reality in all of our lives. The set pieces may be less scary, but I think the experience and meaning of the movie is way scarier and more emotional the older you get and as you grow a family of your own. There's nothing scarier than your child getting sick or hurt. There's nothing in the world that will change your priorities in an instant, like realizing your family is in danger. My favorite moment in the film, and a scene that always makes me emotional, is Diane and Steve's kiss before she goes into the other side. As far as character focus goes, Poltergeist is sorta everyone's movie, but Mom Diane gets white streaks like Nancy Thompson and Ash Williams, so you know that she's the true hero of the movie, and that becomes clear in its surprise fourth act, as the beast makes its presence fully known in the house and tries to take everyone with it. Personally, I wouldn't have had my family stay another night in a house filled with spirits that wanted to take my daughter, but I've seen a lot of horror movies. As an effects extravaganza that's filled with action and scares, the fourth act is what makes the film into a big roller coaster ride that makes its fears of losing a child much more palatable. I know this seems antithetical, but the really in-your-face scares of beasts, explosions, and skeletons make the film less scary, but in a good way. Maybe it says more about me than the movie, but I'd rather be stuck in a half-dug pool full of angry skeletons than lose my daughter to the afterlife. One of the easiest ways for parents to make themselves feel better when something bad happens to one of their kids when they're little is to reassure yourself that they won't remember it. It's too bad that's usually not true. While Steve and Diane believe that Carol Ann doesn't remember her trip to the other side, we soon see that poor Carol Ann really does remember.
No more.
But this is a Spielberg-produced movie from the 80s after all, and like many of his other movies, Poltergeist is about the healing of a family, not its destruction. It's not a despairing or dark movie. It's scary, but there's hope throughout it. And in the end, the Freelings are together and safe, even if their home did just get sucked into a vortex. That approach was a huge hit, and when Poltergeist was released on June 4th, 1982, making $121 million, it was the biggest horror movie of the year by far, and with E.T. released 1 week later, it was officially the summer of Spielberg. But when you're talking about the Poltergeist franchise, you have to talk about the series of tragedies that surrounded these movies. On November 4th, 1982, Dominique Dunne died after being attacked by her ex-boyfriend, passing away at the age of 22. Actor Julian Beck, who played Kane in Poltergeist 2, passed away in 1985 at the age of 60 from stomach cancer, which he had been battling for several years, dying after production and before the film's release. Will Sampson, who played Taylor in 2, died at the age of 53 in 1987 after a heart and lung transplant due to the effects of scleroderma. And finally, on February 1st, 1988, Heather O'Rourke passed at the age of 12 due to misdiagnosed congenital stenosis of the intestine, which she had been struggling with throughout the filming of Poltergeist 3. All of these led to fans labeling the franchise as cursed, and wondering what its creators could have done to bring about these tragedies. Oh, the films really did dabble in the supernatural. The skeletons used in the pool were real. I get that the correlation between a horror movie about a family targeted by the supernatural and the several different tragic deaths that happened to the cast is easy to make. But I think boiling it all down to a curse placed on a movie is actually pretty disrespectful to the people who lost their lives. The truth is that life is filled with tragedies, and plenty of people pass away far too soon. Dominique Dunne's murder at the age of 22 and Heather O'Rourke's passing at the age of 12 are so sad. These are people that were gone way too soon, and in ways that should have never happened. I think we come up with curses to try and explain and categorize tragedies, even in ways that don't really make sense, so that we can apply some sort of logic to how terrible, unpredictable, and unfair life can be. In a lot of ways, horror movies serve the same purpose. They help us think about the worst parts of life, the things we fear but don't want to confront. The losses at the center of Poltergeist are sadly much closer to reality than we'd ever want. Heather was just a sweetheart and shy and beautiful, said Nelson. She was just this wonderful little girl, and she was perfect for the role, perfect for just who she was in her innocence. She was so sweet and easy to work with, and she just took my hand the first day and held on to me for the rest of the time, said Williams. And if I would cry, she would cry. If I would scream, she would scream. Here's this little 5-year-old girl who has this innate empathy. She was truly a gifted little actress. Right, so anyway, after all of that, people love to talk about whether Hooper or Spielberg directed the movie, so I guess we should talk about that for a second. With Spielberg committed to exclusively directing E.T. for Universal, the director was contractually forbidden from taking on any other project during its creation, meaning that, despite being heavily involved from its inception, he could only be a producer. That's where Hooper comes in, breaking into big studio Hollywood filmmaking with the project. But Spielberg himself was consistently on set, consulting with the director, giving feedback to the actors, and even adjusting camera setups throughout production. When this became known to the public, plenty of questions were raised about whether Hooper was actually directing, or just a cover for Spielberg. In response, an open letter from Spielberg to Hooper was printed in The Hollywood Reporter when the film was released, with Spielberg saying, "Regrettably, some of the press has misunderstood the rather unique, creative relationship which you and I shared throughout the making of Poltergeist. I enjoyed your openness in allowing me, as a writer and a producer, a wide berth for creative involvement, just as I know you were happy with the freedom you had to direct Poltergeist so wonderfully. Through the screenplay, you accepted a vision of this very intense movie from the start, and as the director, you delivered the goods. You performed responsibly and professionally throughout, and I wish you great success on your next project." In the years that followed, the Directors Guild of America investigated the film's production and found that Hooper wasn't properly credited by the studio in promotions that leveraged Spielberg's name over Hooper's and was owed money. Later, most of the cast credited Hooper as their director, while Rubinstein said that she was directed by Spielberg during her brief time on set. He was taking more of a hands-on approach, Nelson said of Spielberg, but it was always from a very creative collaboration. There was no tension on the set in that regard. It was determining how you were going to shoot things that had never been done before. I think, in his heart of hearts, he would have loved to have directed it, Williams said of Spielberg. He was always there, and Tobe was not as experienced as Steven was. He very much listened to Spielberg's ideas about things, because it was Steven's movie, really. Spielberg's involvement in the script, storyboarding, and production means plenty of his touches are seen throughout, but the fact is that Hooper was its director, and his trademark ideas of corrupted American dreams are seen throughout the film. Still, people love to question the production. It affected my career, Hooper said about the rumors, but he made sure to continue to hire me to work for him, and he and I remained best of friends. It did not affect our relationship, and he's done all he can do. But once something like that is out there at a given time, you can't take it back. You can't erase it. I know that these days I typically approach horror movies that are part of a franchise as a more wide-sweeping retrospective. But here, I'll just touch on the sequels for context, instead of creating a full franchise history and ranking. Poltergeist 2: The Other Side was released in 1986, written by Michael Grace and Mark Victor, and directed by Brian Gibson, best known for, Poltergeist 2. Here, Tangina and Native American shaman Taylor discover that hundreds of years ago the evil Reverend Henry Kane killed his followers in a cave beneath where the Freeling's home was, and that Kane is the beast. Now, Kane is back and after Carol Ann again, in a movie that's redoing the first, but now with much more lore, monsters, and action. I think it's fine, and has a few moments that recapture the original, like anything with Carol Ann's grandma, but is mostly a reheat. Poltergeist 3 in 1988, written by Gary Sherman and Brian Taggart and directed by Gary Sherman, maybe best known for Dead and Buried, changes things up much more. In what I think is total character assassination, Steve and Diane have sent Carol Ann away to live with their aunt and uncle because Nelson and Williams didn't want to do another one. These parents would never give up on their daughter. They went to the friggin' other side twice for her. Now in a Chicago high-rise, Kane returns again. Sadly, as O'Rourke died at the end of production, reshot scenes in the finale needed a double, hiding her face for a happy ending. Once you realize it, it leaves you feeling very hollow and sad, knowing that while Carol Ann is saved, Heather wasn't. And finally, the Poltergeist remake in 2015, written by David Lindsay-Abaire and directed by Gil Keenan, who would go on to make Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, is the type of remake nobody asked for and nobody really remembers. It's really just the original Poltergeist with less emotional impact and a lot more drones. So yeah, it's like some horrible corporate monster is wearing the skin of the movie I loved, pretending it's always been the only movie like this. I really have very little to say about it, except that it makes me feel like a grumpy old man yelling about how the old ways are best. As for ranking, it's not complicated. Just go in reverse release order. The remake is unsurprisingly the worst, with Poltergeist 3 at number 3, Poltergeist 2 at number 2, and the original at number 1. I know some people might switch 2 and 3, but I think the gap between the original and the rest is pretty big. Watching everything after Hooper and Spielberg's original is really only for people that want more time with these characters despite the diminishing returns. Outside of its sequels, Poltergeist was extremely influential. The idea that a haunted house doesn't have to look like a gothic mansion is a simple but very effective idea. And while the Amityville Horror had already done this to some degree, that house is very gothic, with a massive, tragic history that creates its horror. The horror of Poltergeist can't be as easily explained, and overtakes a very normal home with unstoppable evil. The most obvious successor to Poltergeist is James Wan and Lee Whannell's Insidious from 2010, complete with a haunting of an average home, a child taken to the other side, and a paranormal investigation team that helps the family get them back. Really, I've been a fan of Poltergeist for so long that it was a little hard for me to enjoy Insidious. It's just Poltergeist with less heart, commentary, and originality. To me, Poltergeist will always be one of the best. A horror movie with heart, and a truth that only becomes clearer the older I get. Loving someone means knowing you'll lose them, or they'll lose you one day. But that love will last beyond the grave. Thanks for watching today's video and the next installment in my ongoing supermassive Halloween video series. Poltergeist has been on my Halloween checklist for a really long time, and I've always just sort of kept putting it off and putting it off. And in recent years, rewatching Poltergeist was actually way more emotional for me than it had ever been before. So that was probably also why I kept putting it off. But I thought, why not? Now's a good time. So I'm very happy to finally talk about Poltergeist. And while I briefly touched on the sequels, I mostly just wanted to talk about the original, because to me that is far more important than anything else that came after. Of course, when you talk about Poltergeist, you do have to talk about the tragedies that surrounded it, but I think that the whole Poltergeist curse is really overblown. And to me, it's more important to actually talk about these people as people that experienced real tragedies, instead of some sort of spooky would-be curse. And while the Poltergeist franchise is a very mainstream horror series that is designed to be very broadly appealing in what it does, I think it has this wonderful, very tender heart to it. Like I said, this is a story about a family dealing with loss. And as I've gotten older, that's really just a very powerful message to me. I'd love to hear what you think about Poltergeist and what your favorite haunted house movies are, and where Poltergeist would rank within all those. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons for their continued support. If you'd like to be a patron, it's only $1 a month for early access to every video, including exclusive Patreon-only podcast reviews, all of which are being voted on by patrons for this month. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and having a happy Halloween.